So the next exercise that we're doing is in your book. It's from chapter 5. We're going to show you how to do gathering at the center front bust. This is a bust cluster of gathering. It would be along the center front seam. It is an example that you will need to replicate in your notebook. So you'll want to have a little sketch of what you're doing here with the cluster at the waist, your notes for your information for the steps, and your half-scale drafts in the oak tag as a reference. Okay, so what we're basically doing is we're going to be tracing off our bodice, closing the waist dart, adding a style line and shifting it into the bust, and then pivoting this closed and adding a new design line, grain line to it. So again, I will be working in both the craft paper and the point paper so that you can see that clearly. Okay, step 1, as always, establish your grain line. In this particular case, this is the actual grain of the paper, so for now we're just going to use that. So I'm going to hook my sloper onto that grain line, drop my weights to secure it so it doesn't shift, trace it off so that we can add our style line. So I'm going to trace off my neck, trace off my shoulder, trace off my armhole, including the armhole notch, trace off my side seam. I'm going to trace off this waist dart for now. We'll get rid of it in a moment when we shift it. And my actual bust point. So here's my bust point. I'll make that a little bit bigger for you guys so you can see that on the video there. Then I want to draft in my legs from my true apex, which is basically the sloper. Right, here's my center front. So in this example, we're going to shift the bust gathering right here to the waist so that it's right at the center of a garment. Some nice shearing, very feminine. So I want to identify where my new style line is going to go. So I'm going to make a perpendicular line, in this particular case, directly from the apex to the center front. This will be my new style line. From here, on my style line, I want to back off 1 inch from my bust point, and we're going to create gathering in this area. Now, I want it to be, it's a design line. In this particular design line, it's going to be 3/4 of an inch. So 3/4 of an inch to above the style line and 3/4 of an inch below the style line for this exercise. And there, we'll connect those, that little house, back to my true apex. What we're going to do is we're going to close this out and get rid of it and open up this new design line. So I am going to take my scissors, cut it out. Waist, shoulder, neckline. Armhole. So the waist dart is going to close. We can remove it. But we're going to open up this style line. So I'm going to slash, not through the 8 books, but about 1/8 of an inch away, down the center line, and then from each of those houses. Backing off about 1/8 of an inch, because it otherwise will be too much stress, and it'll fall apart. Now, first rule, right? Establish your grain line. Now, when I hook this up, I'm only going to hook up the bottom bodice to that grain line. I repeat, I'm only going to hook up the bottom bodice because the rest of it's going to pivot. You can see it's starting to naturally pivot already. I'm going to pivot this waist dart closed. I secure it. Make sure the rest of it is secured. Side seam shoulder. This is basically the pivot here. Obviously this top of the garment is off grain, only the bottom part is the grain. We'll talk about the grain in a moment. Now, this is going to be gathering. We want gathering to be equally distributed. So just like we did in the previous exercise, I'm going to spread these out. And because it's gathering, I don't need to worry about punch marks for darts or for tucks for sewing, but I do need to worry about control notches because I want to be able to control how much gathering is going. So I'm going to make a control notch about 1/2 inch away from each to the above and below. Now, because of this gathering, this section here is not going to work on the fold. This effectively creates the need for you to create 2 distinct pattern pieces with this kind of style line. You can see in the notebook that it has a center front seam. So you're going to have an actual seam on this garment in order to effectively create this kind of excess. So I am going to transfer my grain line. I want to follow this, making this grain line parallel. So my grain line is going to be now parallel to what was that center front. There'll be a 1/2 inch seam allowance all along the center front because it's a seam. Seams get 1/2 inch. 1/2 inch on the side seam, armhole, shoulder seam, 1/4 inch on the neckline. We're going to add 1 inch for the hem. And remember, on your half scale, all of these numbers are going to be cut in half. So this will be 1/8, 1/4, 1/4, 1/4, 1/2, and 1/4 now on this center front because it's a seam. So I'm going to show you now, we're going to transfer this information, we're going to add the seam allowance so you can see what that seam allowance will look like. So because we need to blend this area in order to effectively create the seam allowance here. So I'm going to basically use my French curve here, and you're going to lose all those little pieces when you do your blending. So now my seam allowance, 1/2 inch, dot, 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 follow that curve, dot. Now we run perpendicular and parallel 1/2 inch. Neckline, remember this neckline here at the center front, perpendicular to that center front. Dot, 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 follow the curve of your neckline using the dotted method. And then we'll be perpendicular to our shoulder seam, 1/2 inch. Square my shoulders, perpendicular at my armhole. Follow the curve using the dot method, dot, dot, dot. Make sure we are going to transfer that armhole notch into the seam allowance. 1/2 inch parallel, side seam, square, smooth, connect the dots, use your curve tool. Nice and smooth. I'd rather you use your pencil and erase and perfect than have mistakes inked. Permanently inked mistakes will do you no good. Better to erase and make as clean as possible using your pencil. And then 1 inch for the hem. That bottom hem, remember, perpendicular to the center front. Seam allowance. Then what's next? Notch, 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 and label. Hem, side seam, curve of armhole, neckline. This is a pattern piece here, so you want to notch that seam allowance. You want to include your control notches, transfer your armhole notch, notch your center front seam. Make sure you've indicated this is your grain line. And now we get to label. Name, pattern piece. This is front bodice with front center front gathers. Cut 2, fall 20, size 8.